Today's date is April 18th, 2021, and the interviewer is Kathy Xu, she, her, hers, and the interviewee is Olivia Nong, she, her, hers. And do you consent to video and audio recording that will eventually be publicly available on a website?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So the first question is, what role has imagination and or fantasy played in your life? How has it been formative for you?
Um, I think it's definitely been like very formative and like especially like my childhood because my brother and I would always like play with like Playmobiles, which are sort of like little action figures and things and Legos and our stuffed animals. And not gonna lie, I make them talk and they still talk to me back. And that's like kind of like I don't know, I guess like my way of like expressing myself in like other ways, like to my parents and stuff and like with my brother. And like we still like play with our stuffed animals a lot, and that's like something that's like very close to my heart. And I think like now as like I'm graduating, sort of just like I don't know if it's necessarily imagining, but sort of thinking about like different situations or like where I want to live and like what an ideal life would be or where I want to see myself in a certain number of years is something I've been considering a lot lately.
Cool. Yeah, I'm wondering if, first of all, like I do think that like romanticizing about like, or not even romanticizing, maybe just planning like is a form of imagination, or at least that's how I think of it. Um, but yeah, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about like, I don't know, I guess there are two parts. With your like toys, like what are the type of like conversations that you like imagine having, and like why, like what are the type of conversations that you would have with your like toys and like through your toys that like you wouldn't have without them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think like I tend to be very introverted, so like Burrito, my stuffed animal bear, her personality is like very extroverted, like kind of does whatever the heck she wants to do, like says whatever she wants to do. And I think it's like a way for me to like kind of say things and do things that I wouldn't like necessarily feel comfortable saying like as myself per se. And also just I don't know, sometimes I practice speaking Spanish with her because nobody else will like I know like is fluent in Spanish or whatever. And it's just nice to like feel like I'm in the presence of like other people if I'm not necessarily like with around them.
Cool, yeah. And then I guess with the second part, like what, when you are thinking about like your life and where you want to be, like what type of things do you imagine?
Um, I think about like I don't know all these tiny house videos I like watching on YouTube where it's like a family in this really cute homestead in a tiny house, just like not necessarily living off land, but like being self sufficient and but also it's really important to me. I'm really interested in and passionate about environmental activism and climate activism. So I want to find a way to sort of bring that into my life as well. So I'm not necessarily just being an insular person, but also having connection to community as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm wondering if you can like describe more about, I know you said like a tiny home, or like describe more about like the setting, like the type of people that you would be in community with.
Yeah, I think I really like the idea of small spaces because I think they're a lot more practical and also it's a lot easier to become closer with the people you're with because you're more constantly in a space with them and just I think you become more familiar with everything around you versus sort of being in like a big vast space and not knowing everything that you own and everything that you have. And I really like the idea of like a round tiny house that's not necessarily mobile, but just like a really high ceiling with like really like earthy tones, but also not super dark. So it's like light. And I really like natural light is really important to me. So I think having like a space that feels open, even if it's small. And outside, I really want to have like a little garden with different fruit trees. Um, and I think like geographically, like location wise, I don't really know where I see myself, but I think it would be ideal to live somewhere where I could be providing food for myself for the majority of the year. So it's like relatively warm, um, like a wooded area, and I'm like really stuck between living in an urban area because you have a lot more access to different resources like public transportation and other things. Whereas if you're more rural, it's definitely like much easier to have a car, but you're also much more removed from, it feels like, from society and other cultures and just like the culture of where you're living as well. Um, and I would foresee myself like living there with like my future partner and like maybe kids. And like having friends and family visit would be really nice.
Yeah, I love that image. I'm wondering like if basically if like this were in a real world situation with like real world limits, like what would you imagine? How would this like imagination of like your future change? Like what would be the world that you would want to be living in?
It would be really nice to not have to worry so much about like, I guess, transportation. Not that I want teleportation to exist, just because I think that could have so many problems. But I think it would be really nice to not have to worry about being close or far from family and friends, or having to worry about not necessarily weather, but also like if it would be ideal if I could grow food year round, whenever I wanted, if that wouldn't be necessarily an issue of seasons or weather storms or anything like that. And I also think it would be nice to have an ideal world, like obviously, like if there was social and environmental justice everywhere, that would be great. But a way to be connected to community, even while living in a space that's much more insular, if that would be possible at all.
This is just like a side note. I'm curious about like we said that teleportation has its problems. I'm wondering like what are the like problems that you foresee in teleportation?
Well, I think the main problem, I don't have this issue, but like I think the US would have an issue with like regulating who's teleporting where in terms of like state boundaries and like issues with like smuggling things and immigration. And just I think there would be a lot of things that governments would have issues with in terms of like obviously depending on how accessible it is and where people are going and what they're doing. And it would be really easy to like get in and out of areas that are like restricted or like dangerous, or like nuclear sites and issues with terrorism and a lot of other things.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. That's reminding me of like this book called Exit West. I don't know if you've read it, where basically there's like magic portals that open up and it's like talking about like the refugee crisis because like people can just enter into like different countries through these like magical portals. But yeah, I'm curious, would you're like so like you're like even in this like fantastical world or like not necessarily fantastical but like in this world that you imagine there would still be like government structures and like um I don't know, I guess yeah like kind of like the power structures that like our world is organized by.
Oh, I didn't think about that when I was saying that. I don't know. I guess it's hard to imagine a world like without government or like some sort of like higher power. I guess like from things I've read, in just like I read this book called Station 11. That actually hits very close to home because the book starts out with this pandemic that basically ends the world as we know it within like 48 hours. Like television, internet, nothing exists anymore. Um, but it's really interesting, like thinking back on that book, how it follows this group of traveling playwrights, and they just sort of talk about like the culture that has changed in terms of people are self-sufficient, but they're also like foraging and not necessarily like staying in one place. Everybody's much more transitory, or like in transit, moving all the time, um, because of resources. And I think like given the way the government system and everything is set up right now, I think it would be really hard to stay in one place. Like if like government were to disappear, as it were, today, and like so many things that it controls, and things that it regulates, like agriculture and other things, I think there would be like a food shortage crisis and issues of access to resources. And I think it would kind of become like every man for themselves.
Interesting. Yeah, and then other than that, like with what you were imagining, like I love the idea of like self-sufficiency and like being able to like grow your own food. You also mentioned that like you said like that people would be in tune in terms of like social or environmental justice. And I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more of like exactly how you envision that, like what particular like problems do you see being resolved or like maybe not existing whatsoever at all to begin with, and like what would that look like?
I think it would be, well, obviously, it would be really nice if racism did not exist and issues like environmental racism, where like low income people of color communities are like most affected and impacted by issues of like pollution and it's like fossil fuel industries coming in and like buying out entire towns and things. But then I'm sort of thinking about sort of like, I guess racism like is implied by the fact that there is like difference like between race, and then I'm wondering, like, I don't know, I've never thought about this before, so I probably have to think through it more. But I wonder like how much like race and culture could exist like without racism, because I feel like racism like not necessarily upholds like race and culture, but I feel like they're tied in some way that I haven't really considered before. So I'm just thinking about um like, not that I want racism to still exist, but just like what implications that might have, or like how race and culture might change um in response to racism not existing.
Yeah. And I think like a lot of like fantasy or like sci-fi novels like kind of explore that, right? Like what if like basically like changing, like tweaking like one factor of like our society, what happens to the world and once we do that. Um yeah, I'm also curious about where I know that like you're very passionate about like environmental justice, and like you mentioned parts about like environmental racism and also like I don't know, like the again, like the self-sufficiency kind of like relationship to nature. I'm wondering if you could talk more about like the environment and nature's like role in this world that you would imagine for yourself, and why that's important to you.
Yeah, I think that sort of the way the world is right now, it's sort of nature is sort of seen as like separate from humans, whereas like we're really intrinsically tied to all of the natural processes and how things work in like so-called like nature, like the natural world. Where whereas I think like ideally it makes the most sense to, because nature regulates itself, and the reason like it's getting all messed up is because we keep like trying to change things or correct things that have been um, messed up. So I think sort of just letting or finding ways to, I guess, let nature like regulate itself while also like working in tune with nature or like natural cycles, I guess. Um, which also like I know is ideal, but also I don't necessarily want it to be in a way that's like, because in my environmental justice class last semester we talked about how these two like people in this one book, and like we talked about sort of the implications of like survivalist culture and like appropriation of indigenous cultures, um, and I'm just like thinking about like how that can necessarily be balanced and how that can be, or like working with nature and being in tune with nature can exist while not necessarily appropriating indigenous cultures, and also like learning from them and respecting like boundaries and acknowledging that and giving credit to indigenous cultures for like knowing and like for their basically generational knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. I'm also wondering about when you said that like you wanted a way to be like connected, to be able to be connected to community, even if you're like in like a more like insular like living space. That would be really cool. But I'm wondering if you can like talk more about like what you imagine, like who you would be in community with, or like what communities you wish would be able to like come together more easily, or like how like communities would be interacting with each other.
I think it would be really nice, like if I like could create my own community, it would be really nice to for it to be like a combination of like family and friends, as well as um, just like a more inclusive space for like queer people of color and other marginalized groups to sort of just like have a safe space and be able to sort of create and cultivate a community and as well as like the land um, as a group, but also I know I was talking today with some people about how community can become sort of cultish. So finding like a way to also be involved with other groups and groups of people and people who aren't necessarily in your community to be more inclusive and also just not just always be with the same people all the time.
Yeah. And I guess I want to be able to like move a little bit towards like the idea of you personally, like where you're situated in this like world that you would imagine for yourself. So the question would be, if given no real world restrictions, what would be the ultimate self or elements of it that you would imagine for yourself?
Um, I think that it would be really nice to, I don't know necessarily like what form I would take, but it would be really nice for like my mind to be much more in tune with my body, which I know is like possible to do as like a human being, but it's much more difficult. So I think like being able like for my mind to like be able to like know when I need to take a break or like know when I need food, like know when I need to do other things, and also be nice to be like really in tune with other people as well, without necessarily like talking to them. So not necessarily mind reading, but I guess like being more sensitive to other people and other beings, whether they're human or not.
Yeah, and I'm wondering like I don't know, how do you envision yourself like appearing maybe? Like you mentioned like a kind of like a power, like what you would be doing. How would that be like manifested in like your appearance?
I think it'd be really cool to be able to like shapeshift between like different animals, like based off of like my emotions, or like change different colors, sort of like a chameleon, not in terms of like camouflaging, but sort of just like reflecting mood and different I guess like different shapes and like sizes in terms of like whether I'm like afraid like I might shrink down and be really tiny, or if I was I don't know, if I was angry I wouldn't necessarily want to become like huge and scary, but um something like similar in terms of like just like to physically appear as if like how like I'm emotionally feeling would be really cool.
Would that be like a power for yourself or like would like other people also have that power?
I think it would honestly be cool if everybody had that power. So it would be, and obviously like everybody would have different like shapes and forms and colors for their emotions. But I think that would be a really interesting way to be more transparent with other people about how you're feeling, because like you physically cannot hide um, how you're feeling and what you're thinking.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me just thinking about like how that could be both like really like good in terms of like communication, but also how like I don't know, it kind of feels scary, to like think that like you literally physically would not be able to like hide your feelings. I'm assuming that's the case, right? Like
Mhm.
people wouldn't be able to like whatever you're feeling is how it's going to be revealed.
Yeah, I think it would definitely it would require a lot of vulnerability. Um, but I don't know. I think like based off of like recent things in my life, I think that would be nice to like for that something to be more natural and more automatic and like more accepted.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can talk more about like specifically like why vulnerability is, why do you think it's like so important that like you would want this in your like optimal form and world, like what you think that because I'm also trying to think about like how, your reality shapes your imagination, but how your imagination can in return also shape like your reality. So I guess my question is, um, how do you see this like value of vulnerability being like important and being beneficial to our like reality if we were all more vulnerable with each other?
Yeah, I found that just like people in my life I've been more vulnerable with, I've become a lot closer to. And sort of vice versa, like people I'm not as vulnerable with, I'm not as close to. So I think that would help. It would help create stronger relationships that are, I guess, can weather more conflicts and other issues. Just in terms of being able to be more honest with people and also, in a way, just like bring people closer about how they're feeling and where they're at with things in general.
I'm curious, like, if you were able to like shape shift like through all these like different emotions, what would you want? Like, you're like, would you have like a neutral state when like, if you're not feeling like any like thing powerfully, like you would be at a neutral state, or like what would be the dominant like emotion that you would want to manifest?
Um, I guess like sort of not like happy, but I guess not like I guess like not overjoyed, but also not like sad. So I guess like somewhere in between that. And I think it would be cool if you're in that like place, you'd be like kind of like rainbow transparent, like not really a form. But then like when you feel like really strong emotions to like shift into different forms and colors.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if like you would, like look like yourself, but then change colors. Yeah, maybe like more like you would want to be like content, maybe as
Mhm.
like
Yeah, content. That's the word I was looking for.
okay, yeah. I'm also wondering, like, that's really interesting that you would like shapeshift into like not only colors, but also objects that like represent um those emotions. I'm wondering, like, would it be like subjective for everyone that like, you would, or is it kind of like, there's like, I don't know, like almost like yeah, happiness would mean like this selection of like objects that people could shapeshift into, or like it would be more so like what you associate with happiness is what you would become, and what this person associates with happiness is what they would become.
I think it would be more subjective. So like depending on like the person's personal like associations with objects or animals or plants.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm curious as to like what are some objects that you think that you would shapeshift into depending on like different emotions?
I think if I were nervous, I would like turn into a squirrel because I really like squirrels and they're always like looking around and it's really cute. And I think, so I think that was what I would do for like nervousness. In terms of, I don't know, in terms of like happiness, like I think of like a sun. So not necessarily like radiating like heat or anything because that could be potentially dangerous, but just sort of like kind of like a glowing sense, I guess, not necessarily like being shaped like a sun but glowing. And I think like my happy form would either be um, probably like a little hedgehog. Because I really like hedgehogs.
Cute. Yeah. Would you ever be in a human form?
Um, I don't really know. I haven't thought about that so much.
Yeah, I'm curious just because I'm wondering like if, people are constantly feeling things and constantly becoming like other forms based off of like those feelings. I'm wondering if this is like a human world at all, or if like there's like human consciousness, but like no human like physicality, I guess. Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could, I'm still like thinking about how like it seems like community is very important to you as well. And so like thinking about like how would how would people's like different emotions and therefore different forms interact with each other and be in relation with each other, and how might that um build or like take away community.
Yeah, I guess before when I was thinking about like the shape shifting, I was thinking of it in terms of like human like interactions. So I guess like conversation, I think also like body language and like interactions with environment. And in terms of like ever becoming a human form, I was sort of thinking of the sort of like the transparent like floating mist form to be like the equivalent of like a human form, sort of like neutral. Um, and I think in terms of interacting with community, I think it would be, I think the communities would have to, like, because everybody is continuously like changing forms and shapes and colors, it would have to be a closed community for the community to work together, because everybody would have to sort of learn and get used to everybody else's different forms and shapes to actually know who they are, because they're constantly changing.
Yeah. I think it would be really interesting to also see that like I'm just imagining this world play out, and I think it'd be really interesting to see the way that you like visibly affect people emotionally, whether, and also to see like, I don't know, like I feel like it'd be really interesting to see, like, for example, if someone's feeling sad and to like immediately like empathize with them. And then if you felt sad, that you would mirror their emotion and their form. That's super, I feel like that's just really, I don't know, it's just a really cool idea. Yeah. And I'm wondering in terms of like, again, like with like interacting with each other, like one of my like last main questions is in terms of how do you enjoy loving and being loved? And so if you could first start out with like saying, how do you like talking about how you like to be loved by others? Like what are ways of love that you especially appreciate receiving?
Yeah, I definitely enjoy quality time, and actually not necessarily just like, I know some people can just exist with other people and like enjoy that, but I really like doing things with other people, whether it's like going on a walk or having a conversation or doing something like active where you're actually doing something, not just sitting and not doing anything. And I also really enjoy like writing letters and receiving letters. That's a really fun thing that I've enjoyed recently. And I guess also, I guess connecting over like common interests. So like books or I don't know, just like gardening or different things like that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's kind of like, yeah, basically like that you know, you enjoy spending quality time with people and that's how you want to be loved. I'm wondering if that's the same way that like you like loving other people, because you know, the ways that you love and the ways that you are like to be loved are like pretty, I would say pretty interconnected. So if you could talk a little bit about like how you prefer to love other people and like what are the ways that you like to express love?
Yeah, I definitely think for me it's sort of acts of service. So like cooking for somebody or like making somebody a card or doing something for them, I would say is sort of how I express my love for other people.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, how do you like to love yourself? Like, what do you do for yourself?
I really like I like doing things that like make myself like mentally, I guess, feel more clear. So I really enjoy exercising, um, mostly by myself because I think it like gives me like time to like physically be with myself and like think about just like reflect on things and do things, sort of run through things in my mind that I have to do or just clear my head and not think about anything at all. Um, and I also really enjoy reading, so it's a nice way to sort of get lost into somebody else's world. Um, and also just listening to music and cooking are other things that I enjoy doing.
Amazing. Yeah, and I guess I've been asking people to like talk about like what are ways that they see like these forms of love being materialized, whether it's in actions or objects. I know you mentioned quite a few, like you've been talking like, about letters, about like spending time, cooking. I'm wondering if there are like any other actions or like objects that you can think of that you maybe haven't mentioned yet.
Um, I definitely think writing, and then as well as I think just like for myself, just like spending time with family or like physically being with other people is definitely like a way that I feel like more connected to community, as well as just like sitting with myself, like whether it's like meditating or doing yoga.
Yeah. And kind of going back, I'm realizing that like I forgot to ask you this question, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about like imagination and like what power and potential do you think it has for you personally, and then maybe even for like the grander scheme of like societally.
Yeah, I think that I tend to be a very logical thinker, so I think imagination sort of just lets me like let go of all rules and things that I think should be or things that have been, and just imagine what could be like regardless of rules or like how my life might be right now, and just think about like what would make me most happy in that sense. And for society at large, I think that imagination is really tied to creativity, and I think that creativity pushes us to go further than where we currently are, and I think that really helps progress. Whether progress is obviously a very subjective term, but sort of just like I guess change or creating change from where we're currently at. Um, if we only think the way that we're thinking right now, we'll never really go anywhere.
Yeah. And I also know that like in your like little in the like survey responses that you did, you mentioned wanting to feel settled in the moment and being able to do that through imagination. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I think right now I feel not necessarily unsettled, but sort of like fit like physically or geographically unsettled since I've been like in college and going to different places. So I think sort of like thinking about like an imaginary space and being able to sort of just like have that one space and like go back to it and keep adding things on, and having like an existing place that's like more not so transient, I guess, is grounding for me.
Like kind of like a mental space that you can like inhabit regardless of like what's happening in life around you.
Mhm.
Cool. Yeah. Um And I know that like we've talked a little bit about this like earlier, but I kind of want to like keep pushing you and
Mhm.
like hear more about like you said like imagination would be important in terms of like creating change, and kind of just like wondering like what are the types of like changes that you would want to see and would want to make.
I think just sort of imagining things like outside of the way they are. So I don't know, I'm just thinking to like when people see like two sides of a gray or like a box and like one side's black and one side's white and like the other person can never see the other side. So they just keep arguing that this side is the one color that it is. So I think being able to sort of just like get rid of the box in a sense and just like anything being the way it can be, I guess, or sort of finding the full potential for things that people want. I know I'm still speaking very theoretically. I'm trying to think of an example. Um, but I guess like I don't know, like at Davidson, I know there's a CIS major, but like being able to like create whatever major you want, or like not even have a major and just take whatever classes, um, and just different things like that. I guess creating flexibility in spaces or just like creating completely new spaces and ideas.
Yeah, yeah, I would love to be able to just take a class, like take classes without the like concept of like majors at all. Yeah, and I'm wondering if there's like anything that you would like to add about like fantasy, imagination, love, like the like ideal self or world that you would imagine for yourself that you haven't been able to touch upon yet.
Um, Not anything specific. I just think that generally, like, it's really important, like, even if, like, I see myself as a very logical thinker, that, like, imagination, like, really pushes me to go outside my boundaries and, like, pushes me as a person to, I guess, like, have to follow, like, a specific path or do anything just because other people are doing it and create sort of new realities, I guess, outside of whatever is going on in my life.
Yeah. And are there like, is there like a message that you want to leave for like anyone who might be watching?
Um, it's like anything that you imagine, like even if it can't come true, like I think it's still like really important and healthy to think about, or not necessarily think about, but sort of be creative, just like in your everyday life. And I think that is really healthy for just your, I guess, like mental health and like physical health and everything like the way it is can like in your mind be however you want it to be.
Great. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. I just want to make sure like you feel good, like
Yeah,
nothing else you'd like to add. Okay, great. Thank you so much for this.
yeah, of course. It's really interesting to think about like all these different things. It's like I thought about it like when I was answering the questions, but I never like thought super in depth.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been really cool to see like how people answer the questions very similarly or like very differently. Yeah.